Welcome to this AI debate on Are Christmas Traditions Rooted in Pagan Rituals, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from pagan origins and Christian distinctiveness. Now, pagan origins.
In 336 CE, Rome recorded a December 25th celebration. That single date sits at the crossroads of older year-end festivals and a newly public Christian commemoration. When we start there, the question is not whether later Christians invented ritual out of thin air, but how a community with a rising liturgical calendar negotiated time, rites, and meaning against a backdrop of powerful seasonal customs already in popular circulation. Many core elements of what we call Christmas, conspicuous year-end feasting, the use of lights against winter darkness, and the exchange of gifts or tokens, have clear analog practices in pre-Christian winter festivals, most notably Roman Saturnalia, and the cultic observances of the sun god that crystallized in the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti. Those festivals organized social inversion, public banqueting, household merriment, and symbolic illumination. They performed the same social work as later Christmas revelry, which tells us something about cultural continuity rather than abrupt replacement. Evidence indicates that these analogs are not accidental resemblances, but part of a living repertoire that Christians encountered when they made ritual choices in late antiquity. That matters because liturgical calendars are tools of persuasion and integration. Adopting or aligning with a popular festival on the civic calendar was often as much a strategic, communal decision as a theological one. The selection of December 25th for a Christian celebration cannot be read as purely doctrinal if the same date already functioned as a focal point for empire-wide year-end observance. Scholars have shown how such chronological overlap made calendar selection a site of negotiation, not simply an independent revelation. Recognizing this overlap changes the burden of proof. The claimant that Christmas is a wholly new, isolated Christian invention has to explain why churches would choose to compete directly with a widely observed season rather than engage with its forms. The historical record supports the view that Christianity in Europe progressed through prolonged processes of adaptation and syncretism during the early Middle Ages, rather than through the simple erasure of local custom. Missionaries and bishops frequently reinterpreted regional Yule, Germanic, and Celtic practices, displacing explicit pagan ritual language while preserving social functions, seasonal symbols, and popular rites within reworked Christian meanings. That pattern is visible across material culture and liturgical practice. What looks like continuity in form was often continuity in social purpose, now recoded as Christian observance. It matters because understanding this process prevents us from falling into a false binary, either pure pagan survivals or unbroken Christian purity. The truth is plural and procedural, and that has implications for how we evaluate claims about pure religious origins. At the same time, we must be candid. Many of the most familiar material and folkloric features of modern Christmas are late and hybrid inventions, consolidated in the 19th century rather than inherited intact from antiquity. Victorian cultural producers, revivalists, and commercial forces knitted together older motifs, the evergreen as endurance, gift-bringing figures with roots in St. Nicholas and continental Sinterklaas, and seasonal caroling that reworked medieval processional song into the package that now feels timeless. The evergreen tree as a household centerpiece, the domesticated and retail-friendly Santa, and the modern pattern of family-centered gift exchange are products of revival, reinterpretation, and transatlantic hybridization rather than straightforward survivals of Roman rite. Evidence indicates that these later reshufflings matter deeply. They are the reason so many people experience Christmas as simultaneously ancient and newly intimate, as if deep time and modern domesticity met in a single ritual season. Now, I anticipate the central rejoinder, that Christian theology and scripture gave Christmas its identity, so any pagan resonances are irrelevant. That argument overlooks how religious identity is constructed in practice, and how ritual calendars are lived social realities shaped by existing rhythms of community life. The adoption of particular dates and symbols is an act of translation, of bending new meanings around old forms, And the persistence of functionally similar practices across religious change is the very evidence of that translation. In closing, we should see Christmas as a layered cultural creation. Seasonal practices that predate Christianity supplied enduring motifs and social functions. Late antique liturgical decisions aligned Christian observance with popular year-end festivals, and medieval and modern periods actively reshaped local customs into new meanings that produce the Christmas we recognize today. Arguing for pagan origins, in this careful sense, is not the claim that Christmas is a single borrowed ritual, but that its familiar elements emerge through long, plural, and syncretic processes in which important pre-Christian strands played indispensable roles.
Now, Christian distinctiveness.
Consider this analogy. Two songs can share a melody. That doesn't make the lyrics or the message the same. That simple image frames the heart of my response to the claim that Christmas is merely a Christian veneer painted over pagan rites. Yes, forms, lights, evergreens, feasting, gift-giving appear in many winter cultures, but similarity of form is not proof of identity of origin or of purpose. The adoption of December 25th as a day to honor the birth of Christ, its fixation in Christian liturgy in the 4th century, and the way Christian communities intentionally cultivated the nativity story and ecclesial practices demonstrate a distinctly Christian process of selection and meaning-making. The date and feast were not a casual camouflage. They emerged within debates about theology, liturgical calendars, and pastoral needs inside the church itself. To reduce that to mere mimicry misunderstands how religions adopt, redefine, and sanctify time for their own ends. Opponents who insist on a single source origin overlook the historical reality that Christians reinterpreted available cultural material rather than being simply captive to it. When we look at the motifs opponents point to, evergreens, candles, midwinter feasts, we find widespread human responses to the hardships and rhythms of winter. Ancestors across Europe and beyond used light to ward off darkness, trees to symbolize life, and communal meals to sustain bonds during sparse months. These are usable cultural building blocks, not exclusive property of any one religion. What matters is what communities do with those blocks. Christian worship, preaching, hymnody, and the cultivation of saint stories gave those shapes new theological content. Lights became metaphors for Christ as light of the world. Carols and liturgical music framed communal memory around the Incarnation, and the figure of Saint Nicholas was venerated within a Christian hagiographical tradition that emphasized charity and episcopal holiness. Those moves changed the purpose of the practices and placed them squarely within Christian religious life. It is also crucial to distinguish continuous liturgical development from modern cultural invention. Many elements of the Christmas season as popularly celebrated today are not unbroken survivals from antiquity, but relatively recent creations or revivals, especially the family-centered domestic rituals we associate with the holiday after the 19th century. The Victorian reshaping of Christmas, literature, visual culture, and social reform all combined to recast the feast in family and philanthropic terms, demonstrates that modern Christmas identity has been shaped by internal Christian imagination and by later cultural forces, not simply by pagan persistence. Acknowledging that Christian practice sometimes adapted local customs does not erase distinctiveness. It illustrates the Church's long-standing pattern of contextualization in which local behavior was reframed to teach and embody Christian truth. Syncretism in limited forms is a historical reality, but it is not the same as saying the festival's defining meaning and institutional life derive from pagan rites. Moreover, look at how saints, liturgical music, preaching, and parish life produced new practices. The nativity narrative was not a seasonal ornament, but a theological account that shaped preaching, homiletic calendars, and devotional life across centuries. Caroling, far from being merely a folk practice, became tied to liturgy and neighborhood witness in many Christian communities, and the veneration of figures like Nicholas furnished moral exemplars within Christian ethics and charity. To my opponent, who emphasizes lineages of custom, I say this: lineage of form is not lineage of meaning. If two political movements sing the same tune, we would judge them by their manifestos and actions, not by the melody alone. The same standard must apply here. Finally, this matters for how communities remember and teach their faith. If we treat Christmas as a hollowed-out pagan residue, we lose sight of how Christians intentionally crafted a season to proclaim the Incarnation, to form congregations in praise and charity, and to rehearse the narrative that undergirds Christian identity. We can honor historical complexity, recognize shared human practices, admit instances of adaptation, and even celebrate cultural creativity, while still insisting that Christmas, as lived and defined by Christian worship, theology, and institutional development, is a distinctively Christian festival shaped by Christian ends rather than merely inherited pagan ritual. In short, borrowing a melody does not make the lyric foreign. Christian theology and ecclesial practice wrote the words that give Christmas its meaning.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from pagan origins and Christian distinctiveness. Now, pagan origins.
I'll grant my opponent their strongest claims up front. Christians did fix December 25th as a birth feast in the 4th century. Church leaders developed a nativity liturgy and theology to make that date mean something distinctively Christian. And many of the cozy domestic trimmings we now call Christmas are 19th century creations. Those concessions are not defeats. They are exactly the evidence that strengthens the case for pagan origins rather than disproving it. Think about what those facts actually show. Choosing a public, attention-grabbing day, already busy with year-end rituals, and then investing it with new rhetoric and rites is the textbook move of a community seeking to reorient popular practice. If the date had been an internal theological invention with no relation to civic life, why place it squarely on the busiest square in the cultural calendar? The simplest, most historically plausible explanation is strategic accommodation, a new sacred claim made where people were already gathering, feasting, and exchanging tokens. That is adaptation, not autonomous invention. My opponent insists that similarity of form does not equal sameness of origin, and they're right. But the real question is causal direction. Recasting lights as Christ the Light, or converting year-end charity into models of saintly giving, presumes there was an already meaningful practice to be recast. You can't translate what isn't there. When bishops and preachers reinterpreted public behaviors, they were doing the work of cultural translation. That process presupposes continuity of social function, warding off winter darkness with illumination, signaling living vitality with greenery, reinforcing social bonds through communal feasting and gift exchange. Those durable social functions explain why evergreen, light, and gift motifs were available centuries later for Victorian revivalists to assemble into the family-centered holiday we now recognize. Saying the Church taught new meanings over these practices does not explain why those particular practices persisted or why the Church targeted them. It simply describes the mechanism of incorporation. If my opponent wants to maintain that Christmas sprang from a purely internal liturgical calculus, they bear the burden of proof. Produce contemporaneous evidence showing December 25th was chosen in abstraction from civic ritual, and that popular forms played no role in shaping the feast. Absent that, the more historically modest and methodologically sound inference is that Christianity absorbed potent year-end customs and reinterpreted them, producing a layered festival with both pagan roots and Christian meanings. I accept their points about Christian creativity. That creativity is precisely why adaptation matters. The debate isn't whether Christians made Christmas Christian. It's whether the practices they reshaped originated in a cultural context they deliberately engaged, and the evidence of timing, selection, and continuity points decisively toward that conclusion.
Now, Christian distinctiveness.
I agree with their strongest points. Winter festivals with lights, feasts, and gift exchanges existed before Christianity. A December 25th celebration appears early in the historical record, and missionaries and medieval clergy often repurposed local Yule practices rather than erasing every custom. Those observations are useful. They describe the raw cultural materials Christians encountered. But noting available materials is not the same as proving authorship. Let me show why their evidence actually strengthens the case for Christian distinctiveness rather than undermining it. First, shared forms do not equal shared meanings. Lights against winter darkness, evergreen signs of life, communal feasting, and gift exchange are functional responses to a cold, difficult season. Any religious community will use similar means to meet those needs. What matters is who names the meaning. Christian communities took these forms and explicitly reinterpreted them. Lights became metaphors of Christ as light of the world. Feasting was linked to fellowship centered on the Incarnation and the Eucharist, and charity and gift-giving were taught in the shadow of Christ's self-giving. That is theological authorship, not passive survival. Second, the early fixation on a date like December 25th can be read as a pastoral and liturgical solution to theological questions about time, salvation history, and the Incarnation. Choosing a date and building liturgical texts, sermons, hymns, and seasonal observances around it is an act of creative institutional formation. If Christians appear on a civic calendar at the same time as other festivals, the coincidence makes their distinctive theological framing all the more important, not less. Third, when missionaries reworked local practices, they did so selectively and purposively. Contextualization is not capitulation. Converting a ritual form while recasting its meaning demonstrates ecclesial agency. Clergy and communities invented new sacramental and devotional patterns that bore Christian purposes. The Victorian reinventions of domestic Christmas, the family tree, the gift economy centered on charitable narratives, the domesticated gift-bringer tied to a saintly figure, further show active, modern Christian shaping rather than intact pagan survival. Finally, their argument keeps shifting. They rely on ancient analogs to claim continuity, yet also concede that many familiar Christmas elements are modern reinventions. That inconsistency exposes the core problem with their thesis. Either a practice shows continuous, documented liturgical identity from antiquity to today, or it is a later construction. Broad resemblance and shared social function cannot shoulder the claim that Christmas is simply a pagan ritual in disguise. I concede that Christmas is layered and that Christians engaged with existing cultural forms. But those layers were rewritten with Christian meanings through liturgy, theology, and institutional choice. The melody may echo older tunes, the lyrics are unmistakably Christian.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, pagan origins.
I'll start where we agree. Christians fixed December 25th as a birth feast in the 4th century. They forged a nativity liturgy, and many of the domestic trimmings we now call Christmas are 19th century inventions. I accept those points because they are not concessions. They are the evidence I need. When a rising religious movement deliberately chooses the busiest day on a civic calendar, when it adopts common seasonal signs and rhetorically reassigns them, that pattern looks exactly like cultural translation, not an isolated act of theological invention. My opponent rests the case on a clean separation of form and meaning. And that sounds neat until you ask the obvious historical question: why place a new public birth feast on the single date where a whole society already gathers, feasts, and exchanges tokens? If December 25th had no social charge, selecting it would be an odd liturgical gamble. The simplest, most historically plausible answer is strategic accommodation, a community inserting new meaning into an already meaningful moment. That is how rituals survive and transform, through reuse and reinterpretation. They insist that renaming lights as Christ the Light, or framing charity through the Incarnation, is theological authorship, and they're right about the theological creativity. But naming a practice is not the same as inventing the human activity the name attaches to. You cannot rebrand darkness-warding illumination or household greenery if people have never lit lamps or hung evergreens. The rhetorical work of clergy presupposes pre-existing social functions, practical, emotional, and symbolic. Recognizing Christian reinterpretation as agency does not erase the fact that the materials being reworked came from long-running seasonal practices. Their theory requires us to believe that Christians picked the same seasonal materials by pure coincidence or abstract calculation, that lights, evergreens, and gift customs emerged within Christian liturgy ex nihilo and merely happened to mirror popular responses to winter. That is a heavier explanatory burden than the account of adaptation, which is more historically persuasive, an isolated liturgical invention that perfectly matches civic patterns, or a process in which a religion engages, redirects, and sacralizes existing cultural behavior. Finally, note the strategic selectivity. Why adopt winter symbols, not midsummer rites? Why domesticate a public season into household ritual along particular lines? Those are choices that presuppose continuity of meaning and function. For the remainder of this debate, I will press three linked themes: chronological coincidence, functional continuity, and purposeful reworking. And I will ask my opponent to produce contemporaneous evidence that December 25th was chosen in abstraction from civic ritual. If they cannot, the more modest, methodologically sound inference is that Christian Christmas grew by absorbing and reinterpreting powerful pre-existing year-end customs. In the closing, I will show how those themes explain both the ancient adoption and the modern revival in a single, coherent story.
Now, Christian distinctiveness.
I accept the clearest points they just made. Christians fixed a December 25th celebration early on. Church leaders wrote nativity liturgies, and missionaries often worked with existing winter customs. Those admissions are not concessions that weaken my case. They strengthen it once we read them correctly. What they have shown is the list of raw materials Christians found, not the blueprint that proves pagan authorship. Think of it this way. A sculptor works from a block of stone quarried from ancient strata. The presence of older rock does not mean the sculpture is identical to anything that sat above that bedrock. The work of shaping meaning is precisely what I claim happened. First, selection is agency. Choosing a date, composing prayers, staging readings, and teaching sermons are creative acts that impose a theological grammar on public life. That is not passive inheritance. It is authorship. Second, shared social problems produce shared ritual forms. Winter brings darkness, scarcity, communal risk. Lights, greenery, feasts, and gift exchange are functional answers to those conditions. Similarity of form therefore proves convergent needs, not identity of origin. Third, reinterpretation transforms. When lights are explicitly taught as signs of Christ the light, when feasting is framed as fellowship rooted in the incarnation and the Eucharistic imagination, the community has not merely borrowed a prop, it has rewritten the performance. My opponent reads strategic accommodation as proof of pagan priority, but strategic accommodation explains why Christians engaged cultural practices, because those practices were socially effective, and it also explains how Christianity gained purchase, by re-signifying familiar acts so they carried new theological content. Ask them for the unbroken ritual text that demonstrates a single pagan rite, unchanged in meaning, continuing from antiquity into modern Christmas worship. Point to a liturgical book, a sermon, or a canonical instruction that commands the same sacred intent for an evergreen or a domestic tree across the centuries. If that continuity existed, it would be decisive. Instead, what we see are adaptations, selective continuities, and imaginative reinventions, including the clear 19th century domestic reshaping of household celebrations. That pattern is not erosion of Christian distinctiveness, it is proof of it. The Church did not simply inherit ritual identity, it created one by naming, teaching, institutionalizing, and sometimes recrafting popular practices. So yes, Christmas is layered and dialogical, but the decisive fact remains that Christian theology and liturgical institutionality rewrote those layers. As we move to the close, I will press this point. Similarity of form is the raw material for meaning, but theological authorship determines what a festival is. My opponent must now either produce evidence of unbroken ritual identity that proves pagan origination, or concede that resemblance plus strategic adaptation does not amount to origination.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, pagan origins.
We began this debate with a simple historical hinge. A December 25th celebration appears in Rome in 336 CE at the exact moment Christians were negotiating a calendar already crowded with year-end customs. My opponent argued that shared forms, lights, evergreens, feasting, gift-giving, don't prove shared origins. That's true as a logical point, but it misses the historical mechanism. Communities reuse the familiar. When a new religion fixes a holy day into a season full of powerful communal practices, those practices don't vanish. They're folded in, renamed, and given new theology. Concede the Church made a nativity liturgy, and later centuries reinvented domestic details. Those are not contradictions, but part of the same story. The persistence of winter lights, evergreens, and midwinter feasts shows cultural continuity, not accidental likeness. Understanding that continuity doesn't diminish Christmas, it explains why it resonates. If we care about truth, we should accept that many Christmas traditions are rooted in older rituals, and in that honesty, we gain a richer, more honest celebration.
Now, Christian distinctiveness.
Two songs can share a melody. That doesn't make the lyrics the same. We agreed forms like lights, evergreens, feasting, and gift-giving predate Christianity. They even conceded Christians fixed December 25th in the 4th century and wrote nativity liturgies. Those admissions strengthen my case. Christians did not merely copy rituals. They chose a date and composed a story, an explicit theology of the Incarnation that gave those forms a new vocabulary of meaning. Missionaries adapted local customs, yes, but adaptation is not origin. A borrowed garland becomes Christian when it is hung in a church to celebrate God with us, when hymns, prayers, and charity redefine its purpose. The burden was to show identity, not similarity. Similarity of form cannot erase distinctive content. Listen to the lyrics rather than hum the tune, and you hear a different song. That different song is what Christmas has always been.